This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So I got sent this by Empress a little while ago. Now obviously an EQ pedal is an EQ pedal. This has some really cool features on it that I really like, but I think the point is that some of these jobs you could probably do with something like a Boss GE7. You see loads of those on pro people's boards, or you know, I think Boss have a programmable EQ and Source Audio as well. To me, EQ doesn't seem like the most sexy pedal, but I've tried it with a couple of amps and I'm thinking this totally could be the recipe for getting the tones that you want out of an amp that you maybe haven't fully gelled with yet. Now, the thing with most amps is that the tone stacks on them, so say it's a Marshall, they're kind of post the gain stage. They're not necessarily massively effective. You might find things fizzy, or you might think, well, that's a bit too scooped for me. And sometimes you can influence these things with tone knobs, or something like a Mesa Boogie style amp. You've got like bass, mids, and trebles, but they're pre-gain, and so you know, adjusting the bass, for example, turning that up too high, you end up getting like really flubby bass, particularly on the Mark series amps. They're already quite mid-heavy, but if you turn the mids down too much, then you lose kind of body. The treble can give you like more drive, and all of these things can give you more drive, but then you might end up with some really spiky stuff. Or, you know, if you have the presence turned down on the back because you think for the drive, I don't want all of this presence, then maybe it doesn't work so well with the clean. All of these compromises that happen with an amp, because basically like just potentiometers before a gain stage aren't necessarily, I think, the optimal way to dial in tones. And you see there are videos about dialing in Mark series amps and kind of making compromises. To solve some of those issues, Mesa Boogie put on a 5-way slider EQ. Now this is quite common on bass amps. You see they have like 10-band EQs and all that sort of stuff. I'm kind of puzzled as to why we don't see more of this in the guitar world, because I think actually EQ is even more important on drive tones than it is on clean tones. Essentially, you know, the more drive you have, the more you get like a white noise type thing happening, and you might find, well, that's really accentuating the high end of my tone and all that sort of stuff. So I've got the Carolan Tucana here, making zero noise. And I've got this power EQ chucked into the effects loop. Now this is not something that I hear talked about a whole lot, but having tried it on a couple of amps, this to me might be the most useful pedal that you could pair with a channel switching amp, particularly if you've got an amp which has like shared EQ, you know, so like a Mesa Boogie Mark III, you have a bunch of shared EQ. Even on this Carolan Tucana, you've got a channel B and C, but they have a shared EQ. You can change the drive for each of them. PV5150s have that sort of thing going on as well. You know, loads of amps, one of the things that they tend to do to save having, you know, a million kind of controls along the front is to have shared EQ pots. Now, what this also has is a high cut as well. So that can be paired with this EQ. So this is the deluxe version, but the principles are there. So on my drive, for instance, that is kind of perfect for my rhythm tones, but if I go to start taking a lead, I want things to be a bit more mid-push. Now, people would potentially put like a tube screamer in front of an amp to get that mid thing happening, but why not just go to the source and use an EQ pedal? Now, in front of the amp, this would make a difference in the loop of the amp, so between the preamp and power amp, this can make a huge difference. So and the things that you can do with an actual EQ pedal that really, I don't know, I just find that this is actually way more tweakable than on the front of the amp itself. So like you can get in there, you say, right, I want more mids or I want more high. You can open up this high cut. If I wanted less lows. You know, basically you can actually kind of sculpt the sound, and it's not changing the gain structure, so it can still have kind of the things that you're wanting to happen. Whereas if you're using the knobs on the front of like a Mesa Boogie amp, it does change the gain structure. So I think the EQ, for me, I think is a thing that I've completely overlooked for ages. And instantly, like, I went downstairs and tried it with the Catalyst, which has a drive channel, which to me is not my favorite thing in the world. And I think just because of the EQ on it. Just as a case in point here, I've got the Line 6 Catalyst. Now, the heaviest amp on this basically sounds something like this, the settings that I've got it Basically, no matter what you do with the controls, it seems like controls on amps, even if they're like modelling amps like this, are somewhat of a blunt tool when compared to an EQ pedal. So here's the power EQ in the loop. completely getting rid of the fizz, and instead of it being more of a kind of scooped tone, turning it into like a mid-rangey kind of warm type of lead tone that could totally work for me, versus a model or a channel which generally wouldn't really work for me with my single coil guitars particularly well at all. If we chuck this in the loop of that, so any amp with a loop, you can basically totally transform the channels on there beyond what you can do with even the knobs on like a modeler of an amp model. So I think an EQ might be something worth looking into, particularly for this use is totally something that I can see, because this has a boost as well. Particularly to kind of sculpt a drive tone in a way that just isn't as possible on the amp itself. You can't necessarily push the highs as well as kind of trimming off the really ice picky stuff on a normal amp. It's just a bit of a battle, and you're always making a bit of a compromise. With an EQ, that the compromise is kind of over. So I don't know why I've not tried this before. Certainly in the digital world, it's the thing I would do all the time. But this is totally a way that if you have an amp with a drive channel that you're thinking, well, I'm just compromising all the time between having the right kind of clean tone and the right kind of drive tone, well, this totally solves those problems, right? This effects loop, I can switch on or off the effects loop, or I can bypass the pedal. And even for clean tones, you might find it doing things that you like, and instead of it being like you're kind of sort of stabbing in the dark with some kind of drive pedals, and you talk about things like transparent drives, clones, and chucking all these clipping sections, you know, people using a tube screamer with the gain down, or clones with really low drive, but you're not actually using them for their drive benefits necessarily. Oftentimes you might be using them for an EQ curve. An EQ pedal surely might actually be the tool that you were looking for there, especially in the loop like this. Is a way that I've never used an EQ pedal, but totally something that is actually transforming the tone in a really meaningful way. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let me know your favorite EQ pedals in the comments. I think Boss G7 might be an industry standard. I think people really like these. They are a little bit expensive, more expensive than the Catalyst, but I think actually a bit of a Swiss Army knife of a tool which is not that sexy, but could totally transform your tone.